All right, let's jump right into it. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're unpacking something incredibly raw and truly fascinating. We're looking at Sabrina D. Edwards' memoir, An Awakening Journey. This is, well, it's an intensely personal chronicle of some incredibly deep life transitions. What we're really exploring today is essentially the hero's journey of the soul. It's a story of moving through this chaotic wilderness of unexpected change, shedding old limitations, and ultimately finding the courage to step into a grounded, totally authentic personal power.
Right off the bat, the text asks us to confront a really tough question. Where exactly is the line between a profound spiritual awakening and a terrifying psychological descent? I mean, that is the central premise of Sabrina's experience. It's a delicate, complex tightrope, and I want us to approach her story with just profound empathy. We're going to look at the emotional turning points of a woman who experienced both the absolute extremes of the spiritual universe and the heavy, stark reality of the psychiatric medical system.
Sabrina frames the very beginning of her experience perfectly. She writes, "For those who walk the ordinary path, the world is a solid, predictable thing. But for a rare few, the veil doesn't just thin, it shatters entirely." Wow. I mean, that brilliantly illustrates the sudden, almost violent nature of her reality shifting. This wasn't some gentle weekend meditation retreat. No, this was an abrupt, completely unmooring event that just shattered the world as she knew it.
So that brings us to Section 1, the call of the unseen.
We begin back in the early 2000s. Sabrina was a young mother, working full-time, going to school, and feeling this massive void inside. And then, the rabbit hole opens. It started simply enough, just some weird synchronicity. Angel numbers, specifically 1111, began appearing constantly on her digital clocks and receipts. But the definitive moment, the one that truly threw her into the deep end, happened late one night while watching a movie. She describes this crazy moment where the veil just evaporated, and on the screen, literally pasted on a wall in the movie's world, she saw the words, "There is a goddess among us, and her name is Sabrina." She rewound the movie, and the words were gone. The universe had spoken directly to her, and reality would absolutely never be the same.
Now, you might think this was all in her head, but this awakening wasn't just mental. It took physical hostage of her body. She was barely sleeping, literally surviving on just 3 hours a night while raising toddlers. Her hands began vibrating intensely, and they'd move on their own to scroll out these complex math equations that she didn't even understand. And perhaps most terrifyingly, she heard a super clear voice in her quiet apartment from what she called a sun diva, warning her that beings were crossing over and promising she would survive the incoming storm.
Which leads us to Section 2, Into the Wilderness.
By 2007, the sheer pressure of living on $5 an hour while vibrating at this intense frequency finally reached a breaking point. Her reality completely fractured. The world didn't just look different, it got loud. This fragmented, overwhelming static captures that massive sensory overload she describes. Every headline, every banner ad, even words on a cereal box felt like a coded message screaming for her attention. It was just a complete lack of a filter, a totally chaotic collage of input that drove her out of her home in the middle of the night. She followed the unnatural volume of singing birds until she actually found herself sitting inside a stranger's red SUV, just waiting for divine instructions. As you might guess, that incident led to the police being called, and Sabrina was taken to a psychiatric ward. And the cost of the help she received there was really profound. While she was in this highly sensitive, mystical state, she was locked down and medicated. She felt painfully misjudged, actually mislabeled as manic, simply because of her natural athleticism and drive. And the side effects? They were devastating. She gained massive amounts of weight rapidly, feeling her physical identity just being erased pound by pound as she endured this terrifying medicated wilderness.
But here's the thing. Even in that dark hospital ward, the unseen world didn't completely abandon her. Throughout her whole stay, she heard a soft voice continually promising, "I'm coming to get you." Now, no physical person ever arrived to rescue her. But later, when she asked the voice why it never showed up, it replied, "My only job was to give you hope." I think this brilliantly illustrates how she survived, right? That invisible anchor proved that sometimes just the promise of rescue is exactly the light you need to make it through the tunnel yourself.
To truly grasp her story, we have to look at the massive scale of her endurance. This wasn't some quick passing phase. After that initial 2007 crisis, Sabrina spent years caught in a really painful cycle. She'd build her life up, start practicing holistic life coaching, only to have her spiritual channels open way too wide. And that led to exhaustion, hospitalization, and the fracturing of her life and relationships. It was just a grueling, decades-long trial of trial and error.
And that brings us to Section 3, the Sanctuary of Normalcy.
After a particularly devastating relapse left her in transitional housing for 3 years, she made this fierce vow to put her family first. She calls this era the Great Intermission. In 2019, she moved into a quiet little apartment in Nanticoke, Pennsylvania, and she fiercely protected her peace. She embraced the routine of daily life, going to work, raising her children. Crucially, though, she embraced her psychiatric medication, a quarterly injection that dulled all that overwhelming chaos and allowed her to just be a grounded, sane human being. For 6 whole years, she surrendered the high frequencies of the cosmos for the beautiful, predictable comfort of the earth.
Now let's look at Section 4, the Easter portal. You know, her story easily could have ended right there. But without warning, in 2026, the permanent pause button was released, and her dormant gifts were reactivated. But this time, it was totally different. It wasn't chaotic. It was clear. It was authoritative. She received what she calls a multi-layered revelation about being a charge. First, she was shown she has a divine security detail, like an actual angelic force actively protecting her. Second, a charge is a state of vitality that she must actively maintain through breath and prayer. And third, a direct command to stop operating from a place of lack and to literally charge for her spiritual work and light. She was finally transitioning from being overwhelmed by esoteric visions to practical, grounded empowerment.
And this leads to what is arguably one of the most powerful realizations in the entire text. As she processed this reactivation, a message whispered to her, because your mind cracked 20 years ago, that is the reason you can communicate with the divine today. Think about that. The world saw her earlier psychological breakdown as a terrible flaw, right? A huge crack in her foundation. But the spiritual reality was that the breakdown was actually the vital breakthrough. If she hadn't cracked, the light would never have been able to get in.
And finally, Section 5, Becoming the Wave.
This brings us to the final integration of Sabrina's journey, where she fully steps into her authentic personal power. God actually explained her new state using quantum physics, contrasting the particle and the wave. For years, society and the medical system tried to pin her down as a particle, fixed, labeled by her diagnosis, totally stuck in a small life and mere survival mode. But her true identity is the wave. A wave is dynamic. It flows. It isn't limited to just one role. By being a wave, her energy ripples out and acts as a carrier of divine information, positively affecting everyone she touches.
This concept of the burning infinity is the ultimate representation of her spiritual alchemy. It represents an unstoppable, eternal flow. It's a fire, sure, but one that doesn't consume or destroy her like it almost did in her 20s. Rather, it's a fire that burns away old limitations, representing boundless potential and the shedding of all those old, heavy forms. And part of shedding those old forms meant completely redefining her deepest wounds. Sabrina had been abandoned by her birth mother, which is a trauma that shattered her entire life. But the divine redefined this for her, using the word transplant. She wasn't abandoned. She was moved by a higher hand into a different soil so she could survive and eventually thrive. I mean, wow. It completely reframes a painful history into a purposeful, divine placement.
Because she was finally rooted in safe, grounded soil, she received a brand new mandate, the frequency of touch. The divine instructed her to physically touch people for healing. Now, 10 years ago, trying to channel energy would have completely drained her. But now, because she has mastered her boundaries and her peace, she's anchored enough to act as a conduit for the current without being swept away by it herself.
So, what's the actionable wisdom here? What should you really take away from all this? Well, Sabrina's story proves that you absolutely do not have to choose between your mental sanity and your magic. They can beautifully, brilliantly coexist. She strongly advocates for mental health stability, pointing out that medication doesn't necessarily kill your spirit. It can act as a vital earthly tether while you navigate those crazy spiritual heights. If you're meant to have these gifts, trust that divine timing will activate them when your roots are finally strong enough to handle the storm.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative thought from the source material. Look at your own life, your own deep transitions and struggles. What if your deepest cracks, the very moments you felt you were completely breaking apart, are actually the exact places where your light finally gets in? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep reflecting, and I'll see you next time.